Welcome to qiphyedu. Today we'll be looking at monopolistic competition and oligopoly. This is the 6th chapter in the A2 economics syllabus. Alright, let's start. Okay, so first let's take a look at the definition of monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is basically a market that shares some characteristics of monopoly and perfect competition. So a monopoly would basically mean that there's only one firm. Perfect competition basically means that there's a bunch of firms. In a monopolistic competition, there are quite a number of firms as well, but we'll dive into what's the difference of monopolistic competition later on. And then another definition that we need to know is product differentiation, which is basically the strategy adopted by firms that marks their product as different from competitors. Okay, so now let's take a look at the characteristics of monopolistic competition. So you can see I have 5 characteristics listed here. First of all is basically a downward sloping demand curve. Firms basically have some control over the price, and then if let's say there's a decrease in price, it will increase the quantity demanded. This is basically like a typical demand and supply curve that you see in the previous AS syllabus. Alright, and then second is product differentiation. So firms will basically face competition from other firms. So in order to show that they can earn a profit, they will have to find ways to distinguish themselves, maybe through brand loyalty, increasing advertisements, and so in this case, your demand would not be perfectly price elastic. So one or two examples. For example, let's talk about the an iPhone and an Android device. So the reason why an iPhone would be different from an Android device is because of the operating system, and also how Apple would produce the devices. And so most people who are already tied up to the Apple ecosystem may choose to stay with Apple instead of switching to another brand, for example, let's say Samsung, Google, OnePlus. So maybe by allowing the Apple users to actually have some features that they will not be able to have on an Android device, this may help to increase brand loyalty. And so because of this, demand for that particular good may not be price elastic, because people will tend to treat it more like that. Let's say that specific feature is only available for that particular brand, they would then stick with that brand instead of going to another brand, right? And then no or low barriers to entry. So firms are able to join the market if existing ones are making abnormal profits. So a monopolistic competition is something like perfect competition, whereby if you were to enter the market and exit the market, you will not have to pay a high cost. If you're able to make an abnormal profit, then you'll be able to enter without any issues. Same goes for the fact that if let's say you're only able to make a normal profit, then you can leave the market anytime. So you could technically basically you could enter the market, and then but then in this case, compared to perfect competition where you are actually just selling the same good, for let's say your brand, for example, you can produce a different type of item that may be the same category but with features that can differentiate both of these products. So it's a matter of your product differentiation, basically, for monopolistic competition. And then so you can see for the last two, many firms and no dominant firms. Many firms basically is the same as perfect competition, where if let's say you were to do a price change, if you were to change your price, one firm, that will affect the demand of its rival products. Let's say, for example, two computers of different brands, you decide to drop the price from, let's say, 2,600 ringgit to, let's say, 2,400 ringgit. Then let's say the other product is about 2,500 ringgit. So naturally, the computer with same specifications at a lower price would definitely have a higher demand compared to a computer with a price tag of 2,500 with the same features. All right. So with a decrease in price, it will result in one firm actually deciding to, the other firm deciding, people who are deciding to buy the computer that costs 2,500 will end up switching to the computer that costs only 2,400. All right. And then in a monopolistic competition, there's no dominant firms, so it is not a monopoly, and any firm can set on prices. It's not like there's only one firm that is having the most market share for this particular product, for example. So people would end up just switching between brands, if they decide that maybe for them, maybe the price is a concern for them, or if let's say it's brand loyalty, then maybe they will consider staying with that brand. But then it also depends on many factors as well. For monopolistic competition, that's why it's a mixture between perfect competition and monopoly, because the similarities, if let's say we were to talk about monopoly, then the similarity would be that in most cases, if let's say the person is already tied to the ecosystem, then that person would choose not to switch over to another brand. But if let's say you are the kind of person that cares more about money, cares more about value, then it will lean towards the perfect competition, because let's say the computer with same specifications, you'll end up just buying that computer with the same specification but at a lower price. So you may end up switching to that brand regardless. So that's why there's no dominant firm as compared to a monopoly. Alright. And then now let's take a look at the short run equilibrium and long run equilibrium. So in the short run, because there are not many firms in the market, firms are technically going to make an abnormal profit. So you can see that I'm going to represent demand curve, which is equals to your average revenue, because if you multiply price with your output, you will get your revenue, and then your marginal revenue would basically be your revenue that for that additional unit. That additional unit, you get your marginal revenue, all right, for that particular unit. And then for your cost curve, it's going to be like a U shape because of diminishing marginal returns. And in order to increase your profit, in order to maximize your profit, you need to produce at a point where MR equals to MC, which is here, as you can see with the pink curve and also the green curve that goes downwards. So at that point, you'll be producing at a point where you'll make the most profit. So that will be PS. And then you'll be producing at a point where the quantity touches the average cost. And you can see that the average cost is actually lower than your average revenue. So this entire portion would be your abnormal profit. This is how much you earn from selling your product, right? This would be for the short run, MR equals to MC. Your firms will make abnormal profits because of the fact that there are less firms in the short run. In the long run, however, because there are actually many firms, this means that in order to probably increase sales of your products or to increase brand loyalty, you end up having to spend more on advertisements. This will result in your average cost to increase. And when your average cost increases, you can see that from here, that supposedly the average cost position is somewhere around here. But then you can see that for this one, it actually shifts up, and then it's touching AC equals to AR instead of the one that we are supposed to see here, which is the fact that the AC curve is actually lower. But this one is now when the AC curve touches the AR curve, which is at point P1. So this means that you're making basically you're just making normal profit. You're not losing, but at the same time you're not earning, right? So, but then at the same time, you're still producing at a point where MC equals to MR. So technically, if you want profit maximization, you still need to produce at this point. Otherwise, you'll be making a loss. And then, so when you touch this point, when your average cost curve touches your average revenue curve, you're not making a loss, but at the same time, you're not making a profit. All right. And then efficiency under monopolistic competition is basically unachievable because P does not equal to MC. You can see that our P does not equal to MC because here, even though we are producing at a point where MC equals to MR, this doesn't mean that our price equals to MC. We are making at a point where the price is actually higher than your MC. So and then at the same time, you can see that for our price for the long run equilibrium, it is also we're also not producing a point where P equals to MC. In fact, we're actually producing a point where P equals to MC, P equals to AC. So this is due to the fact that we have increased advertising, which results in an increase in average cost. So this means that there's no allocative efficiency in the long run. Same goes for the short run. All right. So that's for monopolistic competition. So now let's move on to oligopoly. Oligopoly is basically a market with a few sellers in which each firm must take account of rival firms, And then the definition here, something that we need to know is non-price competition. It's basically a strategy whereby firms compete by advertising, quality, and design. So compared to a perfect competition, monopolistic competition, monopolistic competition is basically when you have a lot of firms, but then because of the fact that their products are actually Okay, so now let's move on to oligopoly. Oligopoly is basically a market with a few sellers in which each firm must take account of rival firms in the industry. Okay, so compared to monopolistic competition is basically there are a lot of firms, but in oligopoly, there are only a few firms. Let's say like maybe 4 or 5 firms, for example, right? And then you need to know the definition of non-price competition is basically when the firms compete by advertising, quality, and design. So let's say both products are, let's say, 1,500 ringgit. So now, instead of actually focusing on the price, the competitors would then have to focus on the design of the device, the looks of it, the design, the quality, let's say how long it can last, maybe the warranty period, maybe like the features that maybe this thing has and the other doesn't, something like this. All right. So a characteristic of an oligopoly would basically be that there are a few firms dominating the market. Okay, so but then still economies of scale exist, but then it's difficult for many firms to operate at the minimum efficient scale. So there's only a few firms. If there are many firms, it's impossible to operate at the minimum efficient scale. And then for oligopoly, there are barriers to entry. So it's difficult for firms to freely enter or exit the market anytime, which is that's why there's only a few firms in the market, because if they were to enter and exit, they would probably have to pay a cost. And then there's strategic interdependence between firms. So in this case, for example, let's say, let's talk about public transport in Malaysia. Public transport in Malaysia is actually dominated by a few companies. First of all is Prasarana. Second of all is MRT Corp. Third is KTM. Fourth is Fourth is ERL. So these 4 companies make up the rail transport in Malaysia. So in the Klang Valley, for example, if let's say, if you're talking about the commuter rail is basically, this would be the Port Klang line, which is owned by KTM. And then this line goes all the way to Tanjung Malim. And then there's another line that goes all the way down. This one is the Seremban line, which is also owned by KTM, that goes to Pulau Sebang Tampin. And then the northern terminus would be Batu Caves. And then on the bottom, there's also, not on the bottom, but like in the center region or western regions, you also have another line. This one is the Kelana Jaya line. This one is owned by Prasarana, or under its name is called Rapid KL. And then from here there's an extension that goes like this. This one is the Ampang and Sri Petaling line, also owned by Rapid KL. And then from KL Central all the way down to KLIA, it's owned by ERL. And then there's another line, there's actually 2 more lines. I'm just gonna put another one because I'm running out of space. Something like this. This line goes to Sungai Buloh and Kajiang. This one is the Kajiang line. It's owned by MRT Corp, but operated by Prasarana. So let's say if these companies, they do not work together to integrate their stations in together, then this means that if let's say they were to compete with each other, you end up actually building a secondary line beside the Port Klang line, a secondary line beside the Seremban line. This means that you end up actually having consumers to choose between either Rapid KL's line, or end up with KTM's line. And this would result in maybe people would end up choosing Rapid KL because, first of all, KTM commuters' timetable is basically unstable, and for LRTs and MRTs, at least you get 5 or 10 minutes of interval. But if you were to wait for KTM train, it's a different story, right? And then because of the fact that MRT is not owned by Rapid KL, but it's operated by Rapid KL, you could technically, because of the fact that it's basically its service is actually integrated. This means that if you were to switch between MRT to LRT, it's paid to paid, which means that you do not need to exit the fare gates and enter another fare gate. So this brings convenience to a user. But if let's say you end up actually building a secondary line beside, let's say, Ampang Sri Petang line, for example, you'll end up having the consumers to either choose between using that or switch or using a different line altogether. And what will this result in is if let's say if you have only two choices, you obviously will choose the better one. If let's say the Ampang line is not the best option for them, they will choose a secondary line. Then of course Ampang line will be making a loss. So if let's say you were to do cooperation, then it's monopoly end of spectrum. So the entire Klang Valley MRT rail line is most likely, it's not a monopoly, but it looks like a monopoly because of pay-to-pay integration and also integration at multiple stations. But then if let's say you're doing non-cooperation, you'll end up with the competitive end of spectrum. So what this means to consumers is that they have many choices. Well, not to say many choices, they have some choices, but then they'll not choose the worst one, of course. So this means that if let's say these firms, MRT, KTM, LRT, Rapid KL or EIL, they don't work together, then you end up being they'll end up being competitors in this case. So they'll be at the competitive end of spectrum. But in this case, it's mostly monopoly end of spectrum for the rail line in Klang Valley. All right. And then game theory and prisoner's dilemma. All right. So the game theory is basically a method of modeling the strategic interaction of firms within an oligopoly market. And then the prisoner's dilemma is basically an example of a game theory with a range of applications in oligopoly theory. So let's take a look at these two prisoners. Now these two prisoners, they want to gain freedom. They do not want to end up in jail for a long time because of course if you end up in jail for a long time, there are many things you can't do, and you may want to leave jail immediately. But if let's say, first of all, I end up choosing, let's say prisoner A, let's say I decide I be prisoner A, I end up choosing to confess, and then prisoner B decides to confess as well, then both of us will get 10 years of jail term. If let's say I decide to refuse, I'll end up getting 15 years of jail term, and if prisoner B decides to confess as well, and he or she will end up getting 0 years of jail term. So I'm the one that is at a disadvantage if I were to refuse. But if let's say I were to refuse and prisoner B also refuses, this means that both of us will get 5 years of jail term. But if let's say I were to confess and then prisoner B decides to refuse, then I will end up having 0 years of jail term, and prisoner B will get 15 years of jail term. But in this case, if let's say I already committed a crime, I of course have to admit that I committed the crime. If I were to deny, and then they can already have a prima facie case, then of course presented to you, then you'll be at the end of the spectrum where you'll be the one facing a disadvantage even if you try to refuse. Unless prisoner B and prisoner A decides to refuse together, then probably the prima facie case will not be shown up to you. But then if let's say you were to decide that you want to reject, but then end up having that case being presented to you on court, then you are the one at the disadvantage. So most people will end up just decide to confess instead. In this case, right, both people confessing will always be the better option in this case, because first of all, you cannot, because now in this case we're talking about prisoner A and prisoner B. Normally in this case, both of these prisoners will not end up in jail in the same prison. They will probably be separated in different cells. So in this case, you cannot communicate with either prisoner A or prisoner B. Prisoner B will then have to make a choice. Prisoner A will also have to make a choice. And in this case, the best choice would be to confess, because how will you know what prisoner A will decide to say, right? And how would prisoner A decide what prisoner B will say? They have no interaction, they have no communications, they can't even create a motive. It's impossible. So the best thing to do would be to confess, because the chances of that person actually refusing would be very low. In fact, if that person has already committed a crime, then there's a higher chance that they won't be able to deny regardless of how hard they try, because of the fact that they can provide a prima facie case in front of you, right? So then let's talk about dominant strategy. A situation where a player's best strategy is independent of others. So I'm choosing which one will be the best for me. So I will have to confess, because if not, if you decide to confess and I decide to refuse, I'll end up getting 15 years of jail term, which puts me at a disadvantage, right? And a Nash equilibrium is basically when there's a situation when a player's strategy maximizes payoff given the other player's choices. So like what I mentioned, if you choose to go with 10 years, if you choose to confess, you get 10 years of jail term, that other person will get 10 years of jail term. Rather, if that person decides to refuse, you get 0 years of jail term and that person gets 15 years of jail term. But if you choose to refuse, you'll be put at a disadvantage for the fact that you have 15 years of jail term compared to that other person who gets 0. And then if both of you refuse, only then you'll be able to get 5 years of jail term. But refusing is always a second option, because if you already committed a crime, then and the fact that they could already put up a prima facie case against you, then what's the point of refusing? You would have to confess. All right. So in this case, we don't exactly know what our competitors are doing. Like, you have five brands on the market in this oligopoly, and then most people would rather consider that they would actually prefer to have cooperation rather than non-cooperation. If, let's say, these firms decide to do non-cooperation, they'll end up at the competitive end of the spectrum. If they were to be at the competitive end of the spectrum, they will bring themselves more harm, because in fact, they're just not only bringing themselves more harm, they're actually also bringing harm to consumers. Because first of all, if let's say if it's an oligopoly, there's the high chance that the resources that they use are actually considered dominant in. It's considered one of the major products that will be used in, let's say, this country, for example. I can tell you immediately that if it's a cell phone provider, if it's a cellular provider, or is it a Wi-Fi provider, they are definitely in an oligopoly, because there are only a few telecommunications company in Malaysia, mainly Maxis, Digi, Celcom, U-Mobile. Celcom and Digi has already merged. Maxis, Celcom, Digi, U-Mobile, Unify, Yes4G, Altel, etc. So these are companies that are technically in an oligopoly. So you either pay 30 ringgit for this plan, or you either pay 30 ringgit for that cellular provider's plan. All right, and then so in this case, so now you can see that they are in a competition. They are in a competition for getting their own spectrum, their 4G spectrum or 5G spectrum, and then only then they'll be able to produce plans that maybe will be competitive to users. All right, so they are considered at the competitive end of the spectrum. They're just trying to make their plans better, right? And then if, let's say, it's like cooperation, it'll be something like I can't really think of a oligopoly with cooperation at the moment, but I could say that that the cooperation between MRT Corp and Rapid KL would be a good example, because of the fact that even though technically MRT is a government-owned body, it's operated by Rapid KL, and the fact that they serve different lines in the country actually benefits them, because you serve customers from, let's say, Kajang, you serve customers from commuters from Sungai Buloh, you serve customers from Subang Jaya, but albeit on different companies, but it's operated by the same company. And then the fact that you provide a direct interchange at multiple stations actually benefits the consumer and also benefits yourself, because rather than building another line beside your competitor's line, you actually are using another competitor's, you're using the line that you're cooperating with, because this allows you to it makes it convenient for consumers, and at the same time you're also making a profit, rather than actually having to hurt on your revenue. Because if, let's say, you were to build a second line beside MRT, then people would naturally choose the one that is much better compared to capacity. If they have to compare between capacity, the time, and also cleanliness, probably service breakdown. If, let's say, this line always there are always issues with breakdown, then people will naturally choose the better option. So like what I mentioned, this is also a major thing that people will consider when it comes to public transport. Okay, so now let's talk about contestable market. Contestable market is basically a market in which existing firm only make normal profit. The normal profit I'm talking about here is like P equals to the minimum point on the AC, which can be deduced from the graph, as you can see, which is Q2 equals to P3. So you're producing at this point. This would prevent other firms from entering, because if let's say they were to make a profit by actually selling higher than your AC. That's actually impossible because people will buy at the lowest price. But if let's say you were to produce something higher than the lowest point on the AC curve, then this will result in hit and run entry and that is basically when a firm enters the market to take short run abnormal profit, because in a contestable market there's also no or less barriers to entry. Okay, the contestability will be something like this. If let's say the person decides to produce Q1, then they'll be able to make a profit of P1. They'll be able to maximize profit because MC equals to MR, all right? And then the actual cost would be the money that they earn would be something like would be when you can see the AC curve when it touches basically when the AC curve touches the line Q1, that's where you earn, that's the entire area between P1 and P2, and Q1 that will be abnormal profit. If let's say the producer decides to produce at Q3 P2, then the average cost would be you'll be producing at a point where the demand will be the highest, but then your price will be at P2, and then this means that you earn a normal profit. But in this case, right, people will still choose to enter the market, and it's still possible for them to make abnormal profits. So the best way to actually prevent the firm to actually make an abnormal profit is by actually producing at a point where the price equals to average cost, which is P equals to AC, which is at Q2. Alright, so at this point, this is where most monopolies will settle. Alright, they'll be producing a point where their price equals to average cost, and then price equals to average cost. So this would be the higher chance that a firm will be able to deter other firms from entering market to produce at a price that's higher than your AC. Alright, this is the end of this discussion for monopolistic competition and oligopoly. Do share this video out to other people who may need help with A2 economics. As always, stay tuned for the next video. Till then, this is qiphyedu.